This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome everyone. My name is Allyson. I'm directing the Involved Center for Austrian Literature, and this is the follow-up event to our Postgraduate conference that started yesterday. And this panel discussion will be followed by a reading by Arno Geiger, to which you're warmly invited. I'm delighted to have the chance to welcome so many distinguished experts in their various fields of literary studies and translation. And without further ado, I would like to introduce to you my co-organizers, Marcela from Primary University of London and Fiddler from the University of Nottingham, who will also chip into the discussion, but Marcela will take over now to introduce our speakers so we can move ahead and get rid of the minor delay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heide. I think without further ado we can go directly over to Allyson, Fiddler and Geoffrey, but she will be not, I think, the only female writer that we are discussing today, because as I mentioned before, only quite shortly before this kind of discussion, that there is interesting kind of écriture féminine autrichienne. We have Ingeborg Bachmann, but also Marlene Strewowitz, Friederike Mayröcker, and we have today also somebody who is speaking about Evelyn Schlag. That was a kind of intention to focus, that would be affiliating Evelyn Schlag. Then we have also a little bit the kind of male authors writing about probably female or gender topics in Austrian literature. So I would say the combination between Austrian literature, gender discourse is quite a strong one, especially in the 20th century. And over to you. I think we can start as a bit of introduction with Geoffrey, probably as a prominent kind of female figure in Austrian literature and in Austrian language discourse also. So please, Allyson.
Thanks, Marcela. I've got a few slides actually, so I'll roll through those if the technology allows. Which is interesting. Which actually follows on really from your words of introduction, because I think we agree that there is a wealth of very interesting writing by women from Austria, and I thought I'd just flash up a few of these names that you just mentioned. Obviously, starting with Bachmann, I've got some picks here. There's Frischmuth. I'm not doing these in a kind of order, but I think it's interesting to think back and remember some of the texts that we've enjoyed and that have been translated into English. Who else have we got here? Reichert. Top left there is not a very good reproduction, but I like that book cover. It's better than the later one. So her first novel, Februarschatten, Mitgutsch, someone else we were chatting about earlier, here with Die Züchtigung. Where's the mouse gone here? Who else have I here? Actually three there. I couldn't resist the Fashinger titles. These three translated. The DT file seems to have gone in for a Klimt thing on those covers. So what else have we? Brigitte Schweiger, definitely not to be forgotten. Wie kommt das Salz ins Meer? Since I was sort of thinking about gender topics and an earlier text by women writers who've been quite influential. Again, you probably can't see that book cover very well, but Sieglinde Luch's translation. And Amalie Haushofer, Die Wand. And hasn't there just been a fantastic film adaptation, I think just coming out now, that we're all looking forward to seeing. So that's taken a few decades actually, hasn't it, since the original. Right, I'm now important to plug, but I think I'll get onto that with my paper proper.
Here just because I needed something to get my sun out of my hair the other day. I don't think I've got the other ones. Blast! I've gone and deleted it. Yep, should have been in there. I had all of those early titles in a chart going from Haushofer and Klischmuth right up to the later Jelinek publications, just to show actually the difference in time, is coming down, largely speaking. It took a couple of decades before Marcela was translated by Hans Meyer. Sometimes now, look at that with the princess dramas, Jelinek's set of 5 short plays. It's sometimes only a year or 2. I think with the Reichert, no, it wasn't Reichert, it was Fasching's Wiener Passion came out in English the very next year after it had come out in German. So had I that bar chart, you'd have seen, how quickly these things are sort of coming about now. But maybe I could just finish on that one and start with my Lancaster connection, which is to say with this material here, the Sportstück material. We concentrated our energies last year in Lancaster on the subject of the translation into English, into other languages too, actually, but also the translation, as it were, of Jelinek's material from page to stage. And we had at that event the translation by Penny Black with Karin Mundi of Ein Sportstück. And we were able to see how this text could be taken from its original Austrian context, with its author's gaze, I think, very firmly on the ascendancy of the sporty, fit political culture of Jörg Haider and his likes in the 90s, and see how a new play really was fashioned out of this material by the translator, but also by the dramaturg and directors of the material, and that's fantastic to have them here today. Berislav Jurek and Anna Bulkiewicz, who put that production on, and you were lucky enough that there's another chance to see it. Quick plug. In Camden in July, it's 2 airings it's having, 2 nights. So you mustn't pass this by if you haven't managed to see it on its tour last year. There are 2 further opportunities in London in but a few weeks' time, and then it tours, it's going abroad. So that's absolutely fabulous. Penny, I think, had to take we can talk about this later, but she had to take a different set of materials. It wasn't a whole Sportstück that was fashioned into this translation and then onto the stage, but that has now been done. 98, the original, and 2012, the translation. So that's one of Jelinek's texts that's taken a bit longer, actually, to be translated. Since we're focusing on gender, I'm choosing to be a little tangential. I don't know about my colleagues here, but for my allotted time, I thought I might take a little visit of some of the moments in Jelinek, and I have a little handout, actually. Is that it there? Marcela, will you take us to... Let's need some here on the table. I thought I'd visit a few textual passages and see what was going on and how it was dealt with in the translations. So the first bit of material is from Liebhaberinnen. Yeah. So that's number 1 on your handout. So here we are in the mid-70s, and it's just a little excerpt then from Liebhaberinnen, where it reads, Auch ekelt sich Brigitte vor Heinz. Auch Brigitte ekelt sich vor Heinz. That's the heading of the chapter. The English is there too, for those whose German's perhaps not ready for this. So, auch ekelt sich Brigitte vor Heinz und seinem fetten weißen Elektrikerkörper, der auch Heinz heißt. Trotzdem ist sie auch wieder froh, so froh, todfroh, dass sie ihn hat, weil er ihre Zukunft ist. Habt ihr auch eine Zukunft? Bildet einen ganzen Satz. Meine Zukunft heißt Edi. Und all ihre Gefühle muss Brigitte alleine nur mit Hilfe ihrer Muskelkraft hervorbringen, ohne technische Hilfe. Kein Wunder, dass sie überfordert ist. Heinz verwendet seine Muskelkraft, um sich einen Beruf aufzubauen. Heinz hat auch Köpfchen, was ebenfalls dazu kommt. Okay, and you have then a translation which I won't also read, but even though I think, as a translator, maybe Martin Chalmers, when he was translating it, breathed a sigh of relief at the short sentences. I think there will be lots of challenges for him to face, but you do have this very punchy short sentence style. What can one possibly do with Jelinek's names? Not now a section on literary onomastics, but Brigitte, Heinz, Paula, Erich, these names are chosen for a reason, and we could go into the associations, but the fascinating point, trivial point that it may seem at the moment is Jelinek can abbreviate those, can't she? Brigitte becomes B and Heinz becomes H, so that the proximity B, H, short for bra in German, of course, Bustenhalter, is connotative, or it stands for the bra factory, the brassiere factory, where Brigitte and Paula worked and are trying to avoid working by getting themselves a man. So I just don't know what you would do with that as a translator, how you deal with that. I suppose semantic deficit is what you'd come up with in the English. Repetitions, I think you'll see I put die Hochzeit there. That's where perhaps you bring a sigh of relief, because you can just repeat the same stuff again. Heute ist endlich der ersehnte Tag gekommen. Strahlend blaues Wetter begrüßt den lang ersehnten Tag. Heute ist endlich der ersehnte Tag gekommen. Strahlend blaues Wetter begrüßt den lang ersehnten Tag. It's not me sort of typing it out, and that's how it is. Yeah. So there are some shortcuts in a Jelinek text. Flashing forward, winding forward now to much more recent material. The princess plays that I mentioned a minute ago. Again, material that focuses on the female body, its socialization, if you like, in this time into the mediatized world. Not now the body of working class women, but the iconic, glamorous cover girl image of the elite class in the fictionalized figure of, now dead, Jackie Kennedy Onassis. This is Jelinek's princess drama number 4, by the way, so that's Der Tod und das Mädchen 4, Klammern Jackie, from the Death and the Maiden cycle of short plays, which has just been on in Manhattan, Jackie, in Gitta Honegger's translation. So there, what number is this? This is number 2. Okay, so, ja, das machen die Menschen immer. Sie sehen uns, aber sie sehen in Wirklichkeit sich selbst in uns. Eine derartige Kostbarkeit wie ich kommt aber nur richtig zur Geltung, indem sie abwesend ist. Dabei bin ich überall zu sehen. Mit Jacke für tagsüber. Ich kaufe sie im Dutzend, aber nicht billiger. Ich entstehe durch Betonung und Betonierung. Nicht meine Taille, die ist nicht betont. Und mein Haar ist auch nicht betoniert. Es ist lackiert. Ich habe auch eine Perücke, obwohl ich das immer geleugnet habe. Well, the sentences are short here too, to be said in its favour. But Gitta Honegger has had to be very, very creative in choosing how to deal with these compositional variations, on the theme here. It's a sort of punning obsession with beton, betonen, betonieren, betoniert, etc. And she's gone for, I cast myself as a cast, plaster, but not plastered, and not my waist. My waist isn't cast in plaster, and my hair isn't plastered, it's lacquered. I also have a wig, although I always denied it. So I think, she's had to be very clever about how to feed that in. Now, as a method then, translation, Jelinek is no stranger to translating herself. She translated Thomas Pynchon and has sort of done versions of things like Fiddler, farces. She's done some Shaw, Shakespeare, sort of adaptations. various materials, so she's not a stranger to the act or the job of translating, if you like. One university thesis finds that Jelinek's translation of Christopher Marlowe's The Jew of Malta trotz mancher Ausschmückung den Intentionen des Originalautors Marlowe treu bleibt und das Stück durch neue oder erweiterte Kontexte bereichert. So in spite of some embellishment, Jelinek stays true to the intentions of the original author Marlowe and enriches the play with new or augmented context. I wanted to take a quick plunge into a recent Jelinek text that I'm beginning to work on and say one or two things about translation and method in this text. It's Rechnitz, by the way, that I'm talking about. We know, with George Steiner and many others, that any act of understanding is an act of translation. When we read Jelinek, we're generally reading her embeddings of other texts, her translations, sometimes deliberately inaccurate of other sources too, from the contemporaneous to the ancient or archaic. So in Rechnitz, her quasi-acknowledgements, at the end she gives this list, include David Litchfield's book, The Thyssen Art Macabre, Günther Stamm's interview with the cannibal, Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra, Euripides' Bacchae, Übersetzung aus dem Netz, it says, translation from the internet, T.S. Eliot's The Hollow Men, and then it says, übersetzt von einem netten Computer, vielen Dank. Thanks to the computer, the nice computer. Friedrich Kind, librettist of Der Freischütz, and Hans Magnus Enzensberger. The other missing acknowledgement, although it's there in the very title, is Buñuel, because the play is actually called Rechnitz, and then in brackets, Der Würgeengel, which is the German title of Buñuel's Exterminating Angel. So that's, it's fronted, as it were, foregrounded in the title of the play. I think T.S. Eliot suits Jelinek's purposes here very well, partly because the general background of musing on civilization, on, nihilistic or perhaps bearing slight hope, depending how you read T.S. Eliot. This fits Jelinek's bill, although there's no room for any positivity at all in Jelinek's writing. In Rechnitz, we are once more for Jelinek, I should say, dealing with the topic of Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, of digging up the past and digging the graves and digging for the graves plays a sort of literal part in that it's in the words of the play, not action, of course, because there isn't any action in Jelinek's dramas, speaking. So in Rechnitz then, a small border town on the Hungarian border, at Easter 1945, nigh on 200 Jews were killed by the SS near the castle of Rechnitz. The killings purportedly took place on the occasion of a dinner party, and this was hosted by the owners of the castle, Count and Countess Ivan and Margit Spatiani. Margaret being the daughter of Baron Heinrich Thyssen. So Jelinek's, if you like, superficially monologic drama, it does consist of the monologues of several brought-in servants, but also messengers. They drag up the events of that evening. They look back on the atrocities from the perspective of the later generations. And these atrocities have never really been fully acknowledged, let alone adequately explored or indeed atoned for. David Litchfield is very illuminating on this. The horrors of history then are themselves translatable. They repeat and can extend elsewhere as Jelinek's style of history and of its narrative slips from past to future to present and becomes concertinaed into a perpetual series of folds. Number 3 on your handout. Hier wir are. Kommen Sie morgen wieder. Dann vielleicht. Dann hören Sie vielleicht. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but a whip. Und wenn Sie den Anfang verpasst haben, macht es auch nichts. Der Anfang ist zwar ein Gedicht, aber es macht nichts. Sie fängt extra für Sie jeden Moment an, die Geschichte. Sie fängt jeden Augenblick neu an. Aber diesmal wütet sie in anderen Menschen und in Ermangelung anderer Menschen, die sie in die Mangel nehmen könnten, in anderen Städten. So this time, I don't know what you do, that, history rampaging through other people, and for the want of other people, it would want to batter. It rummages in other cities too. I mean, it would take me weeks, I think, take the hat off to people translating this. For example, people like Gitta Honegger, who is translating Rechnitz, and I think that translation is due out soon. She's also translating Kinderlehrtoten and contracted as Kaufmann, so we've got a huge wealth of new Jelinek material in English, people wanting to put it on, for example. So I don't know what the view of colleagues here is about the issue of readability, acceptance, as it were, in the target culture, versus the rougher approach of not smoothing out the qualities and meanings in the original. Not very well often relates, but I'm thinking of the complaints, if you like, of people like Lawrence Venuti, Douglas Robinson, around the invisibility of the translator, the extent to which the smoothing cultural translation effaces the rough edges, and it plays to the commercialism of the capitalist book market, so the argument runs. I wonder then what you would do with the material in the next, what do we do with the showers in the following example? That's number 4. Jelinek's ich morphs many times. It's never wholly possible to fix it to one eye, one locus, a particular identity. And here the ich is provocatively, if you like, and ironically pro-German. The messenger is affronted. The Ich says, Sie unterstellen deutschen Hass, aber ich kann es Ihnen unendlich sagen, egal was ich vorher gesagt habe, ich bin stolz darauf, Deutscher zu sein. Wir Deutschen unter unseren Duschen, den echten Duschen natürlich, sollen endlich wieder Mut zu einem starken Nationalgefühl haben. Wir sollten es ordentlich tuschen lassen, wenn wir gar keine Deutschen sind. Complicated stuff going on in here, but what do we do with this? Do we say we Germans under our showers, the real showers, because the real ones might mean the real Germans, just repeat showers, I think. Or do we do something completely different? We look about, I almost don't want to, I don't think I'll do my versions. It's too offensive, although it would be quite Jelinekian. But anyway, her Duschen, of course, allows her to go to Tuschen. So we need it there in the German, but what on earth would you do with that when translating it? Now, apropos methods of translation, it's clear that the job of literary translators is not at risk. I have a little section here on computer translation for your entertainment. So the ich voice, thinly veiled at this point as the author narrator, rebukes the machine translation method. You'll find that bedded into number 5 in the middle there. Leider hat der blöde Computer das Gedicht nicht so schön übersetzt. Ich hätte es besser gekonnt, aber im Prinzip stimmt es, was hier steht. Es steht hier als Vorbote eines Gedichts. Yeah, so rebuking the stupid computer, I could have translated it better. Because what does it come out with? She claims diese hohlen Menschen, nein, nicht Höhlenmenschen, das sind die hohlen Männer. So T.S. Eliot's hollow men becomes cavemen, she claims, in the computer-generated translation. It's a ruse, obviously, surely. But it allows her then to use this linguistic play further. I thought it would be a laugh to stick a bit of Jelinek into a translation tool, so I did this, and This is what happened. I think we should pity the meta-computer, however, we might be asked to translate Jelinek. So I put in number 6, mit ihren Armen packt sie, die Frau Gräfin Margit, etc., etc. And maybe I'll just read the English, if I can. With her arms she grabs the Countess Margit. One can certainly not say that. So she grabs his left hand. The left hand of the man over there is not it. No, not true. They could also take his right hand, but he has no more rights long ago. It braces the foot in his rib. They may. Eventually she has also shot him. She rips his shoulder from the arm. The balls are already helping a lot, but we also need to help out, or the bullets are powerless. Well, I don't know who understood that, but I didn't. If I can gloss what's going on here, if you don't know Rechnitz, the passage here reflects the use of her intertext as follows. So we've got Euripides, where Dionysus is affronted by Pentheus's disregard for his worship practices and his refusal to worship Dionysus, and he contrives to have him killed. Pentheus goes up to watch the disporting women up in the woods and is killed by his own mother, unwittingly, obviously at this point in her intoxication. She doesn't know whose flesh they are tearing from, because they do then tear of the flesh and eat it. And that's possibly one of the moments, I think, that feeds into the epilogue of Jelinek's play, where she uses some of the online chat that featured in the Oldenburg cannibal case, 2001, something like that. So it's not, as it were, totally unmotivated. It looks like it's tagged on there, but there is textual reason, intertextual reason that's brought it there. So the mother then is fused with Margit Battiani, and the killing of the 180 Jews on the Easter night of 1945 is conflated with the orgiastic Dionysian frenzy of Euripides' play. What do we have here? Well, the English, I think, would have a possessive determiner, his arm, and not a generic one. In the German, we have dem Arm at this point. We have lexical items used twice in the same phrase. The Kugel comes out as balls, and then there's bullets. I mean, I think probably the balls might be usable in Jelinek again, but it surely is an error. So it's bad enough for the brain to sort this out. As I say, I'm pitying the computer at this point. I think the machine translation finds it difficult to locate the nominative subject and owner of the foot, the Z. So in the middle there, den Fuß stemmt sie in seine Rippen, das darf sie, etc. Particularly because the pronoun sie is so far away, it's in the middle of the phrase, and it's so far away from its antecedent noun, from the countess that it belongs to. So elsewhere, Jelinek does the work of bending, distorting the original material herself. So instead of, and this is my last example here, instead of the omniscience of Euripides, the imperfect tense here, that number 7 at the bottom, der ihrem Armen lieh dieser Leichtigkeit der Gott, she turns that into den unseren Armen leiht die Leichtigkeit der Gott, den wir dazu gemacht haben. So, it's not huge, but she's definitely choosing to do different things with the translation. Okay, so located then in the time span of, dramatically speaking, absent cold-blooded murderous action of Rechnitz, so the starving and shooting of Jewish labourers, the Dionysian god is replaced with the frenzy of National Socialism, and the ersatz god of Adolf Hitler. So Jelinek uses a technique of superimposition, much like Buñuel does in his surreal film aesthetics. There you see, den unseren Armen leiht die Leichtigkeit der Gott, den wir dazu gemacht haben. Heil! Aber ja, das heilt schon. So implied in there then is this, as I said before, this intoxication, if you like, the frenzy, the killing orgy of National Socialism. Have I got a clue? Yeah, okay. Well, I don't know. I was thinking how much I was reading my George Steiner actually, and I was thinking about how we're talking about mistranslating, distorting, and how Steiner talks about the trust that goes into the act of translating. And I thought I'd just read that. It says, all understanding and the demonstrative statement of understanding, which is translation, starts with an act of trust. The radical generosity of the translator. And I grant beforehand that there must be something there. His trust in the other, as yet untried, unmapped alternative statement, concentrates to a philosophically dramatic degree the human bias towards seeing the world as symbolic, as constitutive of relations in which this can stand for that, and must in fact be able to do so if there are to be meanings and structures. And then he says that after trust comes aggression. This is where I got interested, from the aggressive voice, the Wut of Jelinek. So this is the second move of the translator then, where he focuses, so this is from Heidegger, when he focuses our attention on understanding as an act, on the access inherently appropriative and therefore violent, of Erkenntnis to Dasein, the thing there, the thing that is because it is there, only comes into authentic being when it is comprehended, i.e. translated. And I wonder, I'm just going to leave translators here on this provocative question, because he talks about the feeling you have from a translation, and Steiner says that every school child, but also the eminent translator, will note the shift in substantive presence which follows on a protracted or difficult exercise in translation. The text in the other language has become almost materially thinner. The light seems to pass unhindered through its loosened fibres. For a spell, the density of hostile or seductive otherness is dissipated. Ortega y Gasset speaks of the sadness of the translator after failure. There is also a sadness after success, that Augustinian justitia, which follows on the cognate acts of erotic and of intellectual possession. So I thought that might be a good point to stop.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Allyson. So we had a fantastic overview from the horrors of history in Peter Jelinek, including the horrors of body, in Jelinek's case, always, and then the violence of the translator. So that's a fantastic kind of...
they're a violent lot.
Yeah, they're a violent lot. And then they are sad, so there is also a kind of melancholic background of translation, probably. We have also in Jelinek the problem of Austrian politics. You mentioned at the beginning, I think, Jürg briefly in connection with Sportstück, and then Rechnitz, Batani, the Second World War, and the Nazi story. Thinking of the panel, and so Jelinek would be one kind of strong personality, and then I was wondering, probably somebody could translate, or is translating Mayröcker, but I couldn't figure out Mayröcker. And
it's a very good book of her poems by Richard Dove.
I was not aware of that, but I discovered Karin Leeder from the University of Oxford, because she's doing Evelyn Schlag. She even won 2004. But she is violating Evelyn Schlag. And she got even the Schlegel-Teague Prize in 2005 for her translation of the selected poems. And we have also another Schlegel-Teague Prize winner, I think my French got also a Schlegel-Teague Prize in 1908 or something a little earlier. But in Evelyn Schlag's case, my first question would be, and then I vote you, why Evelyn Schlag? What was your kind of first idea or concept of why doing Evelyn Schlag in English translation? Why was she so fascinating in a kind of Austrian context, or what is it?
Well, in a way, it's a good question, which I don't have a good answer to, although perhaps an illuminating answer, which is that it came about by chance, as in my experience, many of the things in translation do. So you end up sitting next to somebody at dinner who says, oh, do you know that? And then, or a publisher is looking for someone who happens to be there, at the right time, and says yes. And it's always the moment you need to say yes. And so it started, I think, like that actually. Somebody drew my attention to her poems. I had been working with another Austrian poet, Scott, a man, and we wanted to try and get what we called our three-wheel bandwagon together, which was to do a tour in Britain in 7 cities. This was 2001, taking 2 Austrian poets and my fellow translator, Ian Galbraith, who's a very fine poet as well in Germany. He's Scottish. It's one of those rare things that translates from, rare people who translates from German into English and English into German, which is pretty extraordinary, especially as he does poetry as well as prose. And we were looking for a female Austrian poet. And I said, and so we did this, and we created these events, and then came a request from Coconut to turn it into a book. So it was, at every stage, there were chances and things that just fell into place. But I discovered that that's actually very normal in the translation world, the longer I'm in it.
So pure chance.
A lot of admiration for the work, obviously. Perhaps it needs saying, actually. I was excited by poetry. It seemed to me something that was different. Outside, one of the things I was thinking about was what takes you to translate something, and the more I think about it, the more it seems to me, apart from the money or the opportunity, is finding something that is outside the English language, but not beyond it, so that it brings something to the English language. It's different. It's a different tradition, a different line, a different sound. And it stretches the English language, and so for me one of the exciting things is the opportunity to do that. But I should say I'm not a professional translator, so I have the opportunity to translate what I like when I like, and that's also a big point to make.
So we have also some handouts here, because in the English, and I think it's the poems are here in German and in English. Could you say about her language something a little bit more specific? What was difficult?
Sure.
While translating her, or is there something also Austrian specific maybe in her language or in her kind of ductus?
I haven't translated her prose, and in her prose, for those of you who might know it, there are many more specific Austrian references. I think her poetry is quite an intimate poetry generally. Although I should also say it's changed. The selected poems I did covered, I think, 5 different collections, and so I was covering work from the 1980s through to 2003, and it changed a good deal. When she was first reviewed in the 1980s, she was always reviewed as a feminist, which really upset her. But her poems, and I do have a handout which I'll put around at some point, which you judge suitable. There we go, there are 2 sheets. There's a poem there called Orpheus Weiblich. It was one of the first poems that got her recognition. It's very much about voice, about female voice, about love. And it starts off quite radical in terms of the language. So, for example, you'll see the example on the sheet. The phrases are all in lowercase. She doesn't use uppercase for the nouns, so very often the phrase is balanced between different meanings. You could read something as a noun, or you could read it as a verb. Very little punctuation, so the phrases can be read in different ways across the lines. And it seemed to me that a kind of feminist attempt at language, especially in the poems are often about language and about the difficulty of speaking, but not particularly Austrian. And I think in a way in her poetry it becomes more and more, it's quite an internal, historical, personal landscape. But I should say, and this links to what Allyson said, is that she's also a translator. She's translated Fiddler's his elegies. And so she's very aware of issues of translation, like Jelinek, and plays with things deliberately. And translation as a metaphor is very alive in her work as well. And by that I mean not only the idea of literal translation, but the idea of a kind of metaphorical carrying over, or, for example, somebody being translated into memory. And so there are all these ways in which translation is addressed and operates in the work, and which is done at a very self-conscious level. So words like übersetzbar, here, in the middle of poems, you think, oh, hold on a second. There must be something going on here. So yes, perhaps not so much Austrian, although I've translated other people to much more specifically Austrian, but here a kind of, obviously an Austrian inflection, sometimes in the language, but moving in a more personal territory.
Brilliant. Maybe we can, because I think yesterday somebody mentioned, or we discussed this during the conference, Ingeborg Bachmann and Giuseppe Ungaretti, because Bachmann translated Ungaretti into German, and she was also interested, and I think it's a brilliant translation. We have Jelinek doing Pitch and Marlowe, then Emil Schlag interested in translation. But that would be one kind of topic, and the other would be about female body and writing, and translating this kind of female body language writing into a foreign language. That would be kind of a tricky kind of discussion probably that we could have in combination with Emil Schlag and Jelinek. Could you say something about this kind of écriture féminine in Emil Schlag, kind of specific kind of...
Okay, I have to say something. When I was first asked to do this, I responded by thinking, I can't do this. I know nothing about this. And also, when I'm translating, I don't think about gender. In some ways, I don't think about theory. I know some of the theory, and I found it very interesting as an academic. And that's partly why I emphasise the two sort of hats I have on. And equally, I've written about women, as it happens, I've written about Evelyn Schlag as well. But when I'm actually translating, I don't think about those things. I'm thinking about language and how it works. And I'll be very interested in, obviously, my fellow translators, whether they're doing the same thing. Having said that, I guess it's, for example, in the obvious Weiblich poem there, or that you got on your sheet, or the one about the from Temptations at the top, 10, precisely it's about bodies and femininity, and she plays with language as part of that, so that it is, if you like, always there, but I think as a translator you're always struggling to try and get these words across, and you're really happy if you do, so that making a kind of critical point isn't really uppermost in your mind. Although I have to say that I've often thought of the translator as a kind of being a first privileged reader. And I should also say that I was very lucky to work with Evelyn on this book, and I'm doing a new book of hers, which will take 3 more collections she's done. And having a contemporary author to work with makes it a very different and interesting experience. I've also done some dead people as well. It's very different. Partly, I have to say, one is that Evelyn is she's a translator, so she knows the problems. She has good English, but doesn't think of her English as better than it actually is, which is quite rare among German writers. And she's also very generous, so that, for example, when I went with a query about understanding a line, she said, oh yeah, that line's really difficult, it doesn't really work, I'll change the poem. Which, is again, not all writers would do that, or, she sort of alter things and explain things. And so, for example, one never asks, I've never asked, what does that mean? But I've said, what image is uppermost here? Because this word has 3 different meanings in English. Or there's is it the image that you're worried about here? Is it the music? And she was always very generous in sort of saying, yes, this came out of the personal experience. This is the bit of it that really matters to me. Because when you're translating, there's I can see many translators here, so they know, then you've got to make choices and privilege something over something else. And actually working with someone like that gives you greater freedom. But also working in a bilingual edition. So that was again a greater freedom, it seemed to me. If you're translating, so put it like this, if you're translating the 17th version of Racine, like Edwin Morgan did an amazing version of Racine's Fair to Scots, you can do it, because it's the 17th. If you're translating the first, for the first time, then you've got to be much closer. And equally, if you're doing it just in a book that's just in English, then it's a different audience for if you're doing something bilingually. So anybody that looks at the bilingual book I've done with reference will notice that there are differences in the English poem, and they're not failures of my translation, well, some of them are, but mostly they're places where we agree that something will be better, different in English. Evelyn was for the Poetry Parnassus at the Olympiad last year, 2012, she was the Austrian poet, and she read a poem that we'd worked on together called Paula Ratcliffe. And in it, in the original, Mickey Mouse came up. Didn't really like the sound of it, so we agreed it was Minnie Mouse in the English. So that gives you, it allows that sort of movement that you were talking about to be different. And I noticed Philip Berman, he tells a very good story, I translated Philip Berman, a fantastic American translator, about a whole new chapter in one of the books he did. So in English, there's a different new chapter from the original German. And, that working with a contemporary author then is very exciting in that regard, because it really does make you kind of a bit more, it can make you more of a coach.
So it's not only translating, but also transforming.
Yes.
Yeah. And from this we can go not from Evelyn Schlag to Uwe Telkamp, who is not an Austrian author, but Mike Mitchell is translating him right now, I think, in the middle of that. And inviting him, you wrote me that you are basically not able to say something because you are translating Uwe Telkamp, 700 pages. But you could say something about, I think, Ingeborg Bachmann, because you focused your kind of career as a translator. You did Oskar Kokoschka, Franz Kafka, so the kind of whole Viennese, you could say, fin de siècle, very strongly this. But then also Thomas Bernhard and Ingeborg Bachmann.
Yes.
Please.
Well, so when I discovered I was up here, I desperately tried to think about
female
translation, Austrian, and rummaged around. I came up with some odd facts. I don't know what they'll do, a bit slightly different. What I did was I looked at things I'd done. I did an anthology of Austrian short stories. And the first one I did was, if you look at the classic period from 1890 to 1930. And I looked at that, and I wasn't surprised, I'd never been conscious of this, that all the authors were men. But after 2000, I brought it up from post-war to 2000, and I counted, and 1/3 of the writers are female. And I suspect if I did it now, the percentage will be higher. I mean, I think that probably just reflects the increased both activity and the kind of presence of women writers. But as I say, oh yes, when you were talking about, how could you translate gender and so on, can you do it? There is a kind of inhibition I find in translating. If I give an example, I translated a novel which is not bilingual, but it was set in medieval Germany, and the author said, it was a poor chap who slept out on the walks, and he was something from, I think, Roy or something like that. And I translated it, I thought about it. Should I call it the egg? I thought, well, he says Roy, which is very modern, so I put rheumatics. And there was a review, somebody said, yeah, it's very good, reads very well, except there's the odd anachronism, for example, it's rheumatic, it must be the translator's fault. And because you do worry sometimes, you write something which is incomprehensible, bizarre that the reader might think, oh, the translator just got it wrong. That's a slight inhibition. Anyway, I was trying to think about things, and thinking about the anthology, actually, it did occur to me. There was one story which I genuinely felt somehow, was female or feminine, if you don't know that adjective. Otherwise, I think, as Karen said, it's fairly unconscious. It happens. You do odd items you look at, and you're conscious, he or she does this, does that, and I do it this way. But a lot of it gradually builds up, I hope. And there comes a point usually find, not toward it, where I feel sort of what I'm doing is on the same wavelength as what the author is doing in French or German. But there was one story by Barbara Frischmuth in this anthology where I did have this is sometimes female about the story. But I can't remember consciously doing anything in the translation. I'm just hoping it happened, which is what I tend to do. Another thing that occurred to me, I don't know whether it's any use, is my only contact, in translation terms, with Jelinek is I recently translated a film script, which is a vampire comedy set in Vienna, full of Viennese references. But the dialogues were done by the Ulrike Oettinger, who did the scenario, together with Geoffrey Jelinek. And in this, the vampire that descends on Vienna and causes havoc, but goes after the classic young girl who's wearing dress, and you get two red spots on the neck, is female vampire. And that reminded me of something that anybody has come across this, that whether this is a part of gender, female assertiveness at the time. When I was looking to do this anthology, bring it up to date, I came across a collection of stories called Lass sein mein Gesicht, My Pale Face, which was a collection of vampire stories, all written by Austrian women writers. Now, whether the vampire is something that appeals to women writers in kind of self-assertion, but unfortunately I couldn't use any of those. The ones I like too long for an anthology. My one claim to do, the only thing I can think where it affected my translation consciously was, I recently translated 2 books, which had afterwords. And one was by Matt Frisch, collection with Bachmann, and the other was by Ingeborg Bachmann. And it struck me, the Bachmann was the second one, I think, that in the Frisch afterword, as he said, the editor, Max Frisch, blah, 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 Frisch. But in the Bachmann one, it was Ingeborg Bachmann. And I've always felt that this, I suspect, that women writers object to this convention that they tend to be referred to by first and second name. I mean, you always talk of Jane Austen, but you never, not Austen, but Charles Dickens and Dickens. Anyway, so as a gesture, in this afterword, I translated Ingeborg Bachmann as Bachmann. These kind of things. And I did mention the book of Ingeborg Bachmann I've just finished. Well, more or less finished. This is early in her career. She worked for a radio station that had been set up in the American sector. And thinking, she was eventually came to the script department, and they wanted it to be educational, re-educational for the Austrians, but also it was to be entertaining. idea of a soap opera. Focuses on the everyday story of middle-class Viennese folk. And in fact, it became very, very popular. It was so popular that when, after the Staatsvertrag, and they set up Austrian radio, they chucked out almost everything that was done by the radio station or under the Allied occupation, but they couldn't get rid of this because it was so popular. It's called the Radio Familia. And there were three members of the script team. There was Ingeborg Bachmann and Jörg Malte and someone I didn't know before called Peter Gieser. And in a way it's interesting, but it's difficult to be specific, because on the first hand, although the scripts in general are credited to one of the script writers, I'm sure they collaborated, and even if they didn't collaborate very much on individual scripts, you have to maintain the consistency of character and situation. So, I can't say there's this character, so Bachmann shows it. But it's interesting because it's a soap opera. It uses gender stereotypes. So, there's a husband who's a judge at the Landesgericht, the wife is a housewife, there are two children, a daughter 16, 17, a son 12, 13. And as I say, there are gender cliches. The wife is practical, efficient, she knows what's what, she gets things done. The husband is a nice guy, but he does his work, he's very concerned about people as well as concerned about sending them to prison. But he's a bit head in the air, he's a bit vague, he tends to be lame, forget things, he's always leaving things lying around. And, well, talking to my neighbour last night, she said of somebody that he's a professional invalid, and he's terrible when he's ill. He really makes a fuss when he's ill. He's, it's not just a touch of lumbago, I think they've got a renal tear or something. And his wife and also his sister-in-law deal with this. So you've got the two types there, and of course the daughter, teenage daughter, she's not exactly a giddy, but she's into the latest fashions. Fairly violent, intelligent, but she's picked up the word surrealist, and when they see paintings, she says, it must be surrealist. And she meets somebody whose husband is a composer, it must be atonal. So she's a bit like that. The son is more roughly, plays football in the apartment, he plays cowboys and Indians, but he's also interested in modern science, jet fighters and that kind of thing. An interesting device, the son and daughter both have a best friend who is more along. The daughter's best friend really is a giddy, she's only interested in fashions and that kind of thing. And the son's friend has a friend who's much more rough and ready. He comes round to tea once or to Yowza. And before they go in, the son of the family says to him, the bathroom's down there, you can wash your hands. I don't need to wash them, I washed them this morning. So they play, and then but they also play with sort of suddenly overturning the gender stereotypes. There's one where they're going to the theatre, and it starts with the mother and daughter, and they're getting ready in the hall under control. And then it gets more and more hectic, and can we mend this? I don't like that dress, and it goes on and on. And where's Dad? He's not come home, he's probably forgotten. But at the usual time, Father turns up, quite calmly, all under control. Then they discover that the wife, this practical, efficient wife, has lost her tickets. Where did she put the tickets? And the daughter then rings up her friend, her friend is wealthier and have a car. So they come round to pick them up so they're in time. And the judge asks the father of the daughter's friend, how do you get your women so punctual? You get the joke coming, oh, I tell them it starts half an hour earlier than it really does. You get all this kind of thing. So that, and at the end, they work with this scene, that they imagine the presenter who's going around with a microphone. Yeah. Oh dear, it's terrible making my way through the Christmas shopping with this microphone. And at the end, he sort of says a little piece, often drawing a kind of little moral or a lesson, because it's not supposed to be pedagogical, but so the audience doesn't really realise it. And at the end of this, he says, there you are, you see, when we men are late at the theatre, it's always the women's fault. You thought Frau Wilmer was an exception, wasn't she? But she's not. So that they play with gender stereotypes.
It sounds a little bit as a mixture between Pozarkova and Fiddler, and Jelinek was very much interested in Fiddler, because of this kind of conversational technique, in French comedy. It's brilliant sort of rhetoric.
Yes, so that's funny.
That's, oh sure, that's like a kind of association.
The vampire comedy does have Fiddler
elements, but speaking of language and gender stereotypes, I think as a kind of conclusion, because now everybody presented a little bit this kind of technique of translation and interest in Austrian authors, we have Geoffrey, and he wrote something fascinating, an article that he published in, when was it, 2011, Texte Peter Rosais auf dem Weg ins Amerikanische, der Rhythmus als Übersetzungsprinzip. So, he translated, it is Peter Rosé, Metropolis Vienna, but he also did something fascinating, and I had no idea. That's an Austrian author with a background, I think she was born in Baghdad, and she wrote Susanne Ayub, Mutter und Tochter, also nicht Mutter und Tochter, sondern Mutter und Tochter, and you translated that into?
Oh, now I have to remember. It's Tochter and Daughter.
So that's extremely fitting, I would say, for our discussion today. Could you say something about Ayub and also about this kind of Rhythmus als Übersetzungsprinzip?
That gives me a chance to say, in response to what was said before, that I have these two different jobs. One is the literary analysis and the other is translating. I also translate in a very synthetic way. But then I found out, because I was invited to talk about Peter Rosai at a celebration of his 65th birthday, that I could analyze my own translations and find out what's going on there, and that's a very interesting thing. And so, in this case, I was going to talk about the difficulty of translating Austrian culture into an American context. How much do you leave with questions that have already been addressed? How much do you leave? How much do you explain? And I did a little of that, but I also have worked mostly with living writers. We have a writer in residence program at Bowling Green, which is what started me on translation, translating so the writers could do bilingual readings at our university and other places in the States. And I'm in constant contact with Peter Rosai when I'm translating him, and I've done quite a bit of his stuff. 2 books have appeared. And he said, write about rhythm, talk about rhythm. I said, oh, okay. And he said, yeah, the riff. He said, the riff. And I said, well, let's think about that. And then I went back and found out not only that I could identify riff structures in his original text, but I found out that I had been successfully translating them, which was very gratifying, at least in the examples that I looked at. I haven't done a thorough look at the whole book. And so I talked about that. And that was also gratifying because that's sort of my approach to translation. As I said, I try to do it very synthetically. I do the first translation very quickly so that I can keep that rhythm in my mind and somehow translate it while you're making those syntactic decisions at the same time so that it's not too exotic. My approach is to make the text attractive and readable in English, as well as faithful, but I'm not sure that all those people would be reading Pedro Rosa in the first place. If they happen across it, I want them to open the book and maybe read 2 pages instead of setting it down. You know? And so that has to do with the Rosai approach. And then I decided also to apply it when I first heard about this topic. I recently translated 3 women. By Ulrich Musil. He's my only dead guy. Everyone else I've translated, has been alive. But in this case, it was because the copyright on his work ended at the end of 2012. And so I planned ahead and told the publisher who would publish the Rosai novel, we can do some Musil. And I decided that this would be the best book to do. We don't need another translation of Germano Eigenschaften right now, maybe in 50 years. The dramas are probably not as interesting for an American audience, and Die Vereinigungen are too difficult. So I said, okay, the first text I ever read by Musil, almost 40 years later, I was able to translate. I'd like to say a couple of words about that, but also about Fasching, Lilian Fasching. I've translated a couple of things, and I didn't warn you about this, but it has occurred to me since I've been coming here and been thinking about it. But first, with reference to Susanna Ayub, she was our writer in residence a few years ago, and she wrote a book of poems called Leeder, which is kind of daring in itself, love. And but I sat down with her and worked directly, sitting side by side on my translations of her poems, which is a very interesting and sometimes very challenging way to do it. But this one where she switches the pieces of words around and attaches them to other words, I just had to get rather creative about doing similar things in English. And so the English poem is quite different from the German one in certain ways, just because English has different possibilities. But I think it's also very gender-related. Obviously, the title is about the difficulty of the relationship between mother and daughter, and that the 2 roles get very mixed up. And so throughout the poem, we had to get that mixed upness across, and so the translation had to address that as well. The Fasching, I have not had the pleasure and success of translating one of the books that Allyson mentioned that had been translated into English and published. I translated a couple of plays by her 10, 12 years ago, and then I also translated Stadt der Verlierer for a reading tour that she was going to do in the States, but then I did what I do and went on and translated the whole thing. Not to be recommended necessarily, but I'm sort of an addict. And first I'll address the title. It doesn't have too much to do with the topic of gender, but it is an exchange I had with Lilian Fasching, and I said the title has to be Town Full of Losers, because it comes from a Bruce Springsteen song that's quoted in the book, Thunder Road, a really great song. This town's full of losers, I'm pulling out of here to win, right? And one of the characters in the book likes to try to play Bruce Springsteen, and so he says, yeah, this town is full of losers, talking about Vienna, Stadt der Verlierer. And she said, well, town is it's a city, really, isn't it? And I said, oh, well, Chicago is my own town, Toddlin town. We use the town as kind of an affectionate way to refer to a city. And so that convinced her too. And we haven't had to deal too much with the problem of having Bruce Springsteen in the book, which she quoted him in English in the original German, and doesn't seem to have run into a big problem with copyright. But I think if we tried to publish him in America, it would be way too expensive. So what I've done is I've translated or published in a book that's soon to come out of essays about Bachmann, about Fasching. There are 2 chapters. And one chapter, the book is set up so that there's a chapter that is in the first person from the point of view of a man. And then there will be a chapter in the third person about a woman. And so there's this very interesting gender structure right there. First, there's the first person in which Fasching assumes the point of view of the man. Not only that, it's kind of a murder mystery, and he's the murderer, and he's a psychopath. It becomes clear fairly early in the book without the word ever being used. And so we have to get into his mind. And he's also fairly educated, even though he's living on the edge of society. He's kind of a gigolo. And so he thinks in kind of literary ways sometimes. And so you have to get this across, sort of this high diction when he's talking about really nasty stuff. The sections of the book, the chapters that are about the female main character, who is the detective, are in the third person, and they're satirical. So you have sort of serious first-person psychopath alternating with the satire about this woman who tried to make an academic career and decided she might as well become a detective, right? She couldn't get an academic job. And
interesting option.
And so, in a way, she's the one that's being gently made fun of, right? And so, again, I just translated it as I thought fit, and then went back and realized, and I analyzed this in a little essay I did for that book about Fasching that's going to appear in Ariadne Press this year, edited by Laurie McClary, and it's plain. And I thought, well, that worked out pretty well once I sort of had the abstract question. Well, there's the first person, and then there's the satire. If I could say, sure. No, I just wanted to say one thing about this, because that was my original idea for coming here, and what I did with the Muslim book. Because obviously it's Frauen, written by a male author, and the first sentence in my translator's preface is this is a book about three men. These are three stories about three men. But they all have to do with men approaching women. And the story that I wanted to talk about was the first one, Griecha, if you're familiar with that one. And that one is also very Austrian in the sense that it's multicultural. It's about this man who decides his family's on vacation, he's got some free time, so he's going to go help a guy open up some old Venetian gold mines in South Tyrol. And there he runs into the peasants. And the peasant women are very attractive to him. And there's this one peasant woman, Griecha, who he becomes very attracted to. And so the first point of contact between them is their mutual sexual attraction. It's mutual. But then there are all these layers that he has to translate, sort of in the Steiner sense. Not only gender, and sexually related gender, but also he's upper middle class, educated, she's a peasant woman. She's working some of the time for his company. Her husband might be off in America someplace, we're not quite sure, but she's married. But she also is of this population of people that were called the Mochani, living in Italy, but they spoke a German dialect. But it wasn't an Austrian dialect originally, they came from Germany back in the late Middle Ages to work the mines. This is really historical stuff. And so they speak this ancient German dialect that is German. They're Lutheran too, they're not Catholic like the surroundings. So there are all these layers of cultural translation that get done in the book. The thing I'm going to close with is the immediate practical translation problem. This language, this dialect is quoted in the book. First of all, Griecha is the name of the woman, but it's his nickname for her because that's what she calls her cow, her gray cow. And so there's this transfer of the animal's name to the woman. We'll not go into that here. But then I had to translate and get across the difference between his language and her language. And it was the difference that was the most important thing. And so I had to come up with an English dialect that would work on the basis of difference, but I decided I didn't care whether it was accurate or not, whether anybody ever really spoke this thing. And the three kind of tricks that I did was I had her speak with ye and thou, which was a nice thing to sort of distance it and make it sound archaic. And then I found in the Oxford English Dictionary some odd old words for things, because there's one point where he says, and then she used the word, now I can't remember the German word, something related to shank, for leg. And so I said, well, we'll call that shank, right? And she used a funny word for nose, and I found this dialect word. I was aware of shank, but I wasn't aware of neb as a dialect word for nose. And so I didn't really care whether those two things actually existed together in any dialect. I just wanted to get that difference, but make it communicable to the English-speaking audience. And so I gave up history for the sake of his trying to decode what she was speaking.
Thank you very much for this kind of dense overview also about language choice, and what you have to do as translating not only social, historical, gender context, but also language-wise what you choose as a kind of equivalent in your language. And speaking of this, I would say I have only one small question, then we probably could open the floor, no? I think that could be probably interesting to open a little bit of discussion. How is it about your kind of, if you choose to translate this Edwin Schlag, I was saying Edwin Schlag, and probably you could also choose and Fiddler as an example, and Musil, this kind of very specific language, how close are you following this kind of language pattern that these authors have? What is your aesthetic choice then in transferring this into English? Do you have to make a kind of conscious kind of decision, a rupture, and do you have the impression you are kind of something like a violent translator, and in the end that you did something with the text that's different? Or would you change something, because now I think the translation is already 8-9 years old. Would you select it constantly? Would you not really make it? Yeah,
well, actually, I think what I did was I wasn't sure, exactly. It's always difficult to talk about translation in the abstract. So what I did was I looked back and I picked a sonnet from a sonnet sequence I did, sonnet 9, and so it's on the handout. It's a double-sided piece. And I picked this not because I think it's a great translation, and in fact I think now I would do it rather differently, but because I wanted to show you some of the things, kind of very literal form that were difficult, and what happened. And I guess if you start the German as in the top, in deiner Augen Hoffnung, braune Tiefe, Unblick and so weiter, and then you've got this, I suppose, just over a year, email exchanges for just over a year, different versions, including a couple of comments from Evelyn and a couple of her attempts, which I thought were quite interesting because she takes some of my versions, turns them around, but introduces sort of grammatical oddities in the English, which I have to then say, no, we won't say that. Obviously, we can't go through all that, but there are things that are very acutely embarrassing now I look back. But like you, I always start with a kind of synthetic, fast version. So the first sort of sonnet there on the right is the things I wrote just immediately trying to translate it. And there are some dreadful rhymes in there, but there are some things which last right through to the end, sort of a year later. And there are some things that are just there and will be sacrificed very quickly, but they're there for a rhythm, or the bits that just fall into place and bits that are just wrong, bits that I've misunderstood what was her primary image. So I think, in answer to your question, for me, it's about rhythm. Absolutely, it's finding a poem that can assert itself in English, and it might leave the original Austrian far, far behind. But in order to do justice to that original, it has to work as a poem in English, or a piece of writing in English. And for me, it's rhythm. So whenever I'm translating, I do speak it aloud. Because if it falls there, it falls. I don't think that... I liked your comment about trust and then the violence. I suppose I wanted to say about that there's a very curious thing about trust goes on, because the author puts trust in you, but the reader puts trust in you as well. And I suppose in the middle there's something about trusting an instinctive... It's quite a bold thing to do, it's trusting an instinctive grasp of the language. Or just hearing what must be important, or hoping you do. I mean, sometimes it goes spectacularly wrong, obviously, but so there's a very complicated... Violence, I don't buy, actually. I really don't. I just lots of things about George Stein I don't like, and that is one of them. I'm going to put it. I was thinking about all my experiences of different writers. I've never felt violent. At any point, all felt that I'd taken possession of the poem, because it seems to me that you do understand it better, and actually I've come away always feeling that the poems were richer, cleverer, and more mysterious than I'd originally thought, and there's always a residue which I can't translate. There's something in there which I can't, and I've come away feeling more in awe of the people I've been translating, not that I can carve them up and steam through the poem and boxed it out. So I guess that would be the answers there.
Allyson, could you say something about, are you generally, because you're kind of not obsessive, but you are very much interested in Fiddler, and speaking of translation into English, are you generally satisfied with the translation if you compare them, or is there something missing, or does there shift?
I don't know, I want to do this, on record, because everyone. So no, let's just say there are some that are better than others. That's always the way, isn't it? And I don't think what we have yet, or at least what I've not been able to do yet, is see two different translations, of the same material compared and humbly, of course, I haven't done it myself, so I am genuinely, in awe of translators who tackle. Poetry is very, very difficult to render. But Jelinek's voices are terribly complex, and I would say, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, but German native speakers, it's not a breeze for them. It's not like you sit down and understand every word and how it's put together, and you have to crack it open and think what it might mean and what it might not mean. So, there are some translations I think that are better than others. There are some where, and I'm afraid, across the pond, Jeff and I will have this discussion, 50 cuffs later. But no, there are some things where you think, God, I can't cope with these Americanisms, or vice versa. I'm sure it will rate. But, I think as I probably intimated, there are texts also that are easier to translate than others. But I think it's a mistake to go saying she's not translatable, as indeed some of the headlines said when she had her Nobel Prize for Literature. It's not true. I think that's to sort of that's to forget. I think that translation renders something into something different. That it isn't a sort of mechanical exercise, and it's just that what you come out with is, in some authors' cases, perhaps a bit different to the to the original than would be so with other writers. So it's okay. I'm coping with my Jelinek obsession. It's all right.
So I think we have only 10 minutes, and we can open the floor. Yeah. Please,
Can I ask one question to Allyson? You said the translation from Jelinek, obviously there are elements, like you said, the history might get lost a little bit, and a lot of you said that you translated, something gets lost. I wonder, everybody always speaks about losses in translation. What are the gains? Maybe is in Jelinek maybe the gender issue stronger in the translation? Does it compensate somehow, or I don't know?
It's a very good question. I'm not sure what the answer is, and that sort of haven't analysed, as it were, the literary analysis is more my thing than analysing the translations. I do tend to just read them in German. So what does he gain? Well, I don't know, but I do know that people like Gitta Honegger, when she's been translating some of the material she's looked at, but there is a bonus, there is a gain, but that's because I think she said, what the hell, I'm going to stick a few puns in this sentence. There aren't any in the Jelinek, but I couldn't do it in the previous one, so I'm going to let rip in this. So there's a sense in which you're being creative, that there's a gain, if you like, linguistically. The gender dimension, I don't really know. I mean, we'd be straying, I think, too far from our brief. You know, we started talking about, as it were, whether the relevance of some of her materials, whether it resonates in a British context or an American context. I certainly know from generations of us who were teaching some of these materials that it has its ups and downs as to whether the students of now think it's dated some of these older materials or not. So I'm afraid I can't really answer your question, Birgit, but maybe you're the person to ask it of. Is there something, because you're working, in this field?
Yeah, I don't do anything with Austrian literature, but I'm working with a translation by Strubel, which deconstructs gender, and by deconstructing gender, she also deconstructs national identity, German national identity. And my main argument is actually that the translation is actually interrogating also identity in a broader sense in the target culture. So, because I started off to get this idea because she translated the German pronoun Mann of one of the female protagonists into, most of the time, into I, which gives it a different strength, and it was also the East German character who was then the I person, and the West German character actually, the identity became weaker as the East German character became stronger. Anyway, so that's a translation strategy here, and there were reasons why she did that, and I can't go into that, but obviously there is a stronger identity for one protagonist. So I just wondered whether, when you read translations, whether you have sometimes the feeling, it does come across stronger here or not. And because language, I mean, for Jelinek, as for Strubel as well, language it's the kind of way of subverting concepts within itself. So it's used to construct and deconstruct at the same time.
Yeah.
So that was my train of thought.
It's interesting, I mean, it's tangential. I know that there are a couple of texts, you maybe know Janek's plays Burgtheater and Präsident Armtwind, both of which are written in a kind of mock Viennese, mock Austrian language. And one of them, Jackie Vanson and Helmut Schreckenberger did Präsident Armtwind in this sort of, artificial English. Burgtheater has not been translated, as far as I know. I just, don't know how folk would set about it. But Jeff and Monica, I think you've had to deal with kind of dialect, and you've just been talking about some of it just now. You both had to deal with dialect.
Dialect is, I think, one of the most difficult things. Ariadne suggested I translate from plays, and one was based on a true incident about Viennese actor who's Jewish, married to a well-known, slightly better-known actress, and in the 30s, I think, he gets sacked. And in this play, I'm desperately trying to remember the author's name, he gets sacked and he disappears. And then there comes the news to Vienna that a natural acting talent has been found somewhere in the Tyrol, and he's called to Vienna, and he looks Aryan enough, and he arrived with a great diatribe against cities and decadence and everything in Tyrolean accent. And I got that there. I don't feel you can do that. Now, somebody did it. Performed in Oxford.
It's Mitten,
Yes. Anyway, but I read it, and it seems to me, as soon as you put it into Scottish accent, you're thinking bagpipes and haggis and kilts. I mean, it has the wrong connotations. And I remember I heard a radio broadcast of a play by the 1930s female German playwright, purely in Ingolstadt, and they did it with Irish accents. And for me, it brought up the wrong connotations. Besides the fact, I think they mixed up Northern Irish and Southern Irish. So I find, when the dialect comes up, I just put in non-standard language. I twice used dialect. Once was in a scene in the tour when they're dragon hunting, and there are two huntsmen, and they just exclaim in Scottish. And it's not female, but in Grimmelshausen, there's one place where he's on his travels, and he says specifically, I heard a peasant father berating his son in the local accent. And I felt it's only half a page, so I'll do it into an English dialect. But otherwise, again, I don't know how this relates to gender, but one place which also provided a great, an excellent solution was Friedrich Glauser, the Swiss writer of 1930s, Kriminalroman. And that's in Switzerland, and you have several dialects appear, but fortunately the narrator often comments on it. So that when somebody speaks in some bizarre Swiss accent on the page, I feel that I can add, we talk about it. He said in Bernese or something like that, because that's because the narrator does that. But you mentioned the Tutor, he keeps putting things in Saxon, but the narrator doesn't explain things. He uses the characters as a kind of perspective, and they wouldn't explain. So I don't know what to do with that. But that's.
Just really quickly. I'm aware that you, Mitchell, translated Schwab. And it was probably a big journey because I know that also Mary Oakes translated Colin Mother's Biggest Benton, and I think, as far as I remember, you translated that as Chernobyls. So that is
the president, Werner Schwab.
Oh yes, Werner Schwab.
So I think that this gender, you probably encountered that problem at the very title of play.
Yes.
There is no female gender for the female president.
That's right, yes.
So I just wanted to ask you really quickly about your experience of translating Schwab and translating culture and his collage with words.
That was a long time ago. It was reminding me when Geoffrey said about incorrect. I mean, the thing with Schwab is the German is not quite correct. I mean, he uses the wrong preposition with the verb or something like that, or things that don't collocate together, and you have to do it in English. And I was reminded that the American German getting the sandwich. She wrote the introduction. She kept saying, yes, that's wrong, but it's not as outrageous. That was the difficulty. I remember that not so much the Präsidentin, because that's basically all female. But the one that's based on Haydn, Schnitzer, where you have couple after couple after couple. And there you do get gender. But I found that his language is so disrupted that I don't think that's connected with a specific male or female. It seems to me it's within the situation, but it's something about the alienation of something of people, and in Präsidentin, and it's particularly women. But I wasn't aware of it as a gender question, and I'm not. I was glad to see that they were performed last year in America.
Yes, but it's just from the title, it's a problem because there is no female president, or you can call it chair lady, or so Mary Talks Calling Mothers, which is very
Christian,
very far away.
I call it first ladies.
First ladies. There's also a version of chair lady.
But it could be, has kind of.
So we have 5 more minutes before we go over, I think, to the Austrian culture for Anna Geiger. Are there any more questions, please? Yeah, oh, sorry, exactly.
I'd like to make a comment on your question on the possible gains of translation.
Gains of
Yeah, and there's something I've been working on. So I'm not a translator, so I can't really talk of like the feeling of loss that you experience when you actually do the work and then lose some of the poetic quality. But I think where there can be gains or, I don't know, clarifications is when you consider how much of the language of the writer is transitive and intransitive. I think Wittgenstein makes this distinction at one point. So the intransitive would be the poetic quality of something, and so it's essentially not translatable, but the transitive can be explained in other words. And I've been working out on music among my qualities, and it occurred to me that the most interesting philosophers who commented on music, as far as I see it, are French. And so I've been, because the secondary literature of music obviously in the German-speaking world, it's more literature specialist, it's more taking place in Germanistic, whereas important philosophers and more not only logicians actually and are commenting on him in France. And I thought that might be linked to the translation that exists, because music's language is extremely rich in images, and he, I think, spend a lot of time making very abstract things extremely concrete and finding different kinds of vocabularies and having ultimate descriptions of the same conceptual, content that is behind it. And in France, then, you couldn't use all these possibilities that maybe German has in that sense. It is a bit more flexible than France, maybe. So many of these concepts had to be translated into standard philosophical vocabulary, I would say, with more Latin roots, which is vocabulary that you would also find later on in German philosophy of maybe the second half of the 20th century, because language changes. And that was my reflection on that. I mean, thanks to this translation, which opened up this big work to a different cultural context, different aspects of this work could be brought up that maybe were forgotten in the initial language. Yeah.
I think the big translation issue there is irony. I was going to mention that earlier. Even in Frauen, but especially in the Mann Eigenschaften, it's just soaked in irony. And those ironies come from a lot of the things that you've mentioned, and that's a hard thing to translate. So there's sort of a tone that I try, I don't know if I succeed, but I try to get, because the tone itself is very important.
Well, just on Turles, I think irony is not particularly that's very direct.
Right.
And it's awful to try and make it, to get the sense of what's going on, this turmoil inside, at the same time to make it understandable, clear. And I might ask, how do you translate Seele?
I'm almost tempted to say that it's something the other way around, which is that one of the things it seems to me that's different about Austrian and German literature from a kind of English tradition is that poets and writers are prepared to say the big things about souls. These big, erratic statements, these huge things. I've just been writing about translating Rilke, for example, and then you bring it into English, and English, contemporary English is so ironic. You can't talk about souls. Contemporary English poem, and so it's finding ways actually to kind of get that irony, that lack of irony into a language and into a sort of envelope where we feel very, very worried about these big statements and abstracts and so on. And it's slightly different from what you're saying, but I've been thinking about it as you were talking. It seems to me that's one of the cultural differences, and possibly a place where you can kind of reinscribe a different cultural context and gain something into the culture too.
It's interesting why it's the complementary translation problem. It depends on who, when it is.
great to understand their participation here, but I just thought, I was thinking the problem of translating Thomas Mann, who is ironical from start to finish, who is a distance away from the very land he's using. And I don't think I read anything, not even by really good translators such as David Luke, who managed to get this across. And so there's this terrible reputation that poor old man has got of every footing and learning and so on. Well, there's simply the discrepancy between the mind and the language that he's using is ironic really. It's a difficult one.
I think that would be a fantastic topic for all the debate, translating irony in Thomas Mann and Robert Lucy and the differences. But it's very rich. So thank you very much. I think Arno Geiger is waiting, we can say that. And there is we don't have drinks here. We will have drinks in the Austrian Cultural Forum over in South Kensington. Thank you very much for this fantastic debate. I hope it was stimulating. Yeah.